Rick Anderson is the Associate Dean for Scholarly Resources and Collections in the J. Willard Marriott Library at the University of Utah. I think Rick is probably well known to us as a well-known speaker on the library publishing circuit. He has been for the last, maybe 2 years, has been a contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen blog. I always make sure I read his posts. It's always useful to hear from our customer base, and particularly when they want to talk to us about the rational discussion, or is there a rational discussion about open access? So Rick, welcome.
Thanks very much. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. At the beginning of the meeting this morning, Jane mentioned that she said that I had promised. I don't recall this, and I didn't drink anything last night. But apparently last night I promised not to upset you with this talk, and I want to amplify and maybe qualify that a little bit. And I'm going to do so with some thoughts that occurred to me last night as I was fruitlessly trying to fall asleep. I'm usually suspicious of thoughts that occur to me while I'm trying to fall asleep, but we'll see. So here's my thought. Listening to true statements that are pleasant to hear is kind of like eating a cupcake. You know, it feels good in the moment, but in the long run, it doesn't really do you an awful lot of good. On the other hand, listening to true statements that are unpleasant is a lot more useful for a couple of reasons. One of them is, it's more useful because you're likely to respond to the unpleasant truth in one of two ways. Either you're going to accept and assimilate that unpleasant truth and end up changing the way that you think and act, which is, of course, useful to you, or you're going to respond to the unpleasant truth in a way that shows those around you that you can't be trusted to act in good faith, which is very useful to the people around you. Now, I've tried hard to make sure that this talk consists of true statements, but this topic is a difficult and a controversial one. And the first time that I presented the lecture on which this presentation is based, it was back in March at the Smithsonian Institution, and it was to an audience that consisted largely of people who did not want to hear these things. And their responses have been pretty predictable along the lines that I've described, and I'll share some of those with you a bit later. You guys are a very different audience, and I don't expect that what I have to say here is going to be very difficult for most of you to hear. So my challenge today is going to be to try to make this talk more useful than eating a cupcake. One way that I've tried to do that is by adding some updated information reflecting developments since last March, including some of the responses that I've had since then to the talk itself. Responses that I think maybe tell us a lot about the issue under discussion. So let's start by talking about the big problem. The big problem, of course, is that every stage of the research and dissemination process costs money. And I think everybody understands, everybody on all points of the open access spectrum, everybody understands that doing the research costs money. And I think that most people understand that archiving and curating the resulting documents costs money. But the idea that turning research results into documents costs money and that making them available costs money is a little bit more controversial. And in fact, just last week, anybody who follows either the Spark OA forum listserv or the LibLicense listserv got to see one prominent OA advocate declaring that green open access can be provided without cost. So that's good news. I don't know how many of you read the Times Literary Supplement. Those of you who do may have noticed in the September 19th issue that there was a letter to the editor from an Oxford fellow whom I cannot help quoting verbatim here. He said in his letter, "It is only paper copies of journals that involve any significant cost." And he then went on to say, in case his point was missed, online journals cost almost nothing to produce. So there's more good news, I think, for everybody in the room. But here in this forum, speaking to this audience, I really don't anticipate much resistance to the proposition that each of these points in the publishing process represents a costly stage. So then the question is, where do these costs get absorbed? Historically, the initial costs of doing research have been borne by some combination of public and private grant makers, and by academic institutions who pay the researchers. Historically, the cost of turning research results into documents have been borne by a combination of academic institutions who employ the authors and also most of the peer reviewers and quite a few of the editors, and by publishers. And an important underlying dynamic here, I think, an important underlying social dynamic behind this whole issue is the fact that really nobody, I don't think, much objects to grant funding agencies being supported by tax dollars. Nobody really objects to universities being underwritten by taxes and tuition, but the idea of publishers charging readers for access to content that results especially from publicly funded research is increasingly controversial for a couple of reasons, and those reasons are, first of all, economic, and second of all, philosophical. So the economic objection arises from the fact that prices, especially for journals in the STEM disciplines, are just rising too fast relative to stagnant library budgets. And yes, it's true that we librarians have been saying this to you since the early 1970s, but that's because the trajectory has been obvious since the early 1970s. The fact that in the intervening decades we have generally renewed most of our subscriptions does not mean that we're going to be able to keep doing so indefinitely. And in fact, the crunch has already begun. I know that at my institution and at those of most of my colleagues, all of us are now, today, canceling journals that we would once have considered core. In fact, we still consider them core, but we have no choice. The only way that we can absorb the price hikes that are being levied by publishers of other core titles, and of course, the built-in price hikes of our big deal packages, is by canceling journals that we consider to be core. So whereas in the past we might have looked at a list of journals and said, oh, this one looks like a good one, let's subscribe to that one. Today what we are doing is looking at lists of journals and saying, who can we afford to make angry on campus? What do we have to keep in order to stop the faculty from burning down the library? That's the level of decision making that we're at right now. So the philosophical objection comes from the fact that not only are research funds very often provided from public coffers, but also that universities are paying the salaries of the authors and of most of the peer reviewers and of at least some of the editors. And for many people in my profession, the idea of then paying what are in some cases genuinely extortionate prices for the products of these people's work is becoming harder and harder for librarians to accept. So the combination of real-world fiscal pressure, concrete fiscal pressure, and anger is what has given rise to the open access movement. So let's go back to the four-part problem that I mentioned earlier. I said that it costs money to perform research, and it costs money to turn research results into publishable scholarly documents, and it then costs money to make those documents available to the world and to archive them permanently. But the third statement in that list is actually a lot less true than it used to be. Because in the current information environment, as we all know, and we discussed some of this morning, an author can disseminate research results effectively, globally, and at virtually no cost to him or herself. All you've got to do is set up a WordPress blog account for free. You don't even have to pay the $18 a month or $18 a year for a clean.com URL. You can just make it myresearch at wordpress.com. And for nothing, you can put all of your papers up and disseminate them to millions and millions and millions of people. So this means that dissemination in the current environment is for all intents and purposes free. But this raises a very interesting question. If dissemination is now free, then why is it that publishers are continuing to survive? And if, as some people claim, scholars just want to get their work out there, get it out into the world where it can have an impact on their disciplines and build their reputations and be read by millions of people, then why is it that authors keep feeding their manuscripts into a slow and inefficient and expensive system that prevents everybody except paying customers from having access to their work? Well, one answer, I think it's actually the primary answer, is that scholars, for the most part, don't want maximum readership above all else. What they really want more is for their work to be taken seriously. And that means that they need more than just dissemination. What they need are review and certification. Telling the world that you've discovered a cure for cancer is very easy. And if you want to see how easy it is, Google the phrase cure for cancer and see how many thousands of people out there will tell you that all you have to do is eat half a pound of ginger root every day and you'll be cured of your cancer or whatever. Telling the world that you've discovered a cure for cancer is easy, but what scholars and researchers want and what's difficult and what costs money is the process of taking submission of those claims, weeding out the obvious nonsense, subjecting what remains to coordinated review, editing and formatting the papers that make it through that review, making them available, and creating and maintaining a robust and well-organized archive of them. Authors want that process to exist because of what that process says about their work when it makes it through the process. It signals to their peers that their work is solid scholarship and that it deserves to be taken seriously. Any model that proposes to do some or all of these things and then give the resulting documents to readers at no charge faces a really serious problem, and that is that it's going to have to get financial support from somebody other than readers. Now, I mentioned earlier that academia underwrites some parts of this process, but it's also true that there are very real costs involved that are not covered by academia, and if the review and the certification are going to be done, then those costs are going to have to be absorbed somewhere. Subscription models recover their costs by charging readers. Open access models do it by covering costs in several different ways, each of which poses a variety of upsides and downsides, which is only to be expected. What concerns me, though, is that there seems to be a very strong tendency, especially among some of the most prominent and influential voices in the OA community, to insist that the discussion of the models used in open access, that discussion focus exclusively on their benefits, and to discourage and even punish any discussion of costs and downsides. Now, I realize that those are both kind of strong statements, and I want to look at them separately. So first, the statement that open access models vary in their responses to the problem of cost. These are the two most prevalent models. I think all of us here are pretty familiar with how they work. Under the gold model, articles are made available immediately upon publication. The publisher is usually either supported by an institutional subsidy of some kind or by charges that it imposes on authors. Under the green model, an article is typically published in a toll access journal, just as it normally would be, but then some version of it, very often the peer-reviewed final manuscript, is deposited in a public repository and made available freely, usually after some embargo period that allows the publisher to try to sell access to it before access becomes free. Each of these two models, just like toll access models, involves costs and benefits, and each of them, just like toll access models, entails consequences that are both intended and unintended. So here are some of the upsides and downsides of the gold model. The greatest upside of it, obviously, is free public access. That is a tremendous benefit that's offered by the gold model. Broad dissemination, which is primarily a benefit to the author, is another major upside of the gold model. The downsides include that the fact that under the author pays model, research funding has a tendency to get directed away from new research and toward the dissemination of old research. Now, that's not necessarily a bad trade-off, but it's a very real trade-off. Nobody thinks that an author who submits an article to PLOS is paying, what is it now, $3,000? Is paying that $3,000 out of his or her pocket. That's being written into grant funding. That is $3,000 that does not go to support research. Another downside is that in the case of a subsidized open access journal, that represents institutional funding that is being directed towards that journal and away from something else. That's not necessarily a bad trade-off, again, but it is a trade-off. One of the biggest problems with the gold OA model is that it entails perverse incentives. Anytime you have a model whereby the publisher makes more money by accepting more papers, you have a built-in structural incentive to accept subpar work. Now, most gold open access publishers do a very good job of resisting that incentive and of publishing high-quality work anyway, but there is a growing number of opportunistic, the commonly used term now is predatory, open access publishers who are doing exactly the opposite. And that is a very real cost, a very real downside that needs to be discussed, and I'll touch on that again a little bit more later. If we look at the green open access model, again, the upsides include free public access and broad dissemination, major benefits. The downsides include the fact that the green open access model undermines subscription revenue by making content freely available that would otherwise be available only by paying a subscription. And it also entails perverse incentives, but this is kind of interesting. In the case of the green OA model, the perverse incentive isn't felt by the publisher. It's felt by the open access advocate, and here's why. Since green open access depends absolutely on the existence of formally published articles, that means that a green OA model can only survive to the degree that the articles are hard to find and hard to use. Because the easier they are to find and to use, the more likely it is that subscribers are going to cancel their subscriptions in favor of access to the green versions. The more people cancel subscriptions, the more publishers go out of business, and ultimately then the model fails. The green OA model can only succeed by failing. If it succeeds too much, it eats its host. Now, what I've tried to do up to this point is to lay out as accurately and as fairly as I can the issues that have given rise to the open access movement, the dynamics that are currently at play, and both the positive and negative implications of those dynamics. And I hope that I've made it clear that I see both very real and significant benefits and also very, very real costs and downsides to all open access models, just as I do with subscription models. And this brings us to the second statement that I made a minute ago, the one about an unwillingness in the open access community to have a discussion that takes seriously both the downsides and the unintended consequences, along with the upsides and the intended consequences of open access programs. And I'm going to provide some examples of how this unwillingness is played out, including examples of responses to the lecture on which this presentation is based, which I originally gave. I can't remember whether I mentioned this earlier, at the Smithsonian in March of this year. The reason I specify that is that when I originally gave the lecture, it was a read text. And the reason that I read the text and then put the exact text up online was that I've learned from sad experience that if you don't do that, it's very easy to get misquoted, especially on Twitter. And I wanted to be able to refer people to a genuine, accurate text. So at discussingoa.wordpress.com, a blog platform that I set up for free, I listed the full text of, I posted the full text of the lecture and invited comments. I wanted this to be a place where we could discuss the issues. And let me tell you, if you want to see some shining examples of the problem that I'm talking about here today, check out the comments on that page. One OA advocate in particular, when the issue of predatory publishers came up, simply refused to acknowledge that predatory OA publishing has anything to do with OA. Anyway, well, here's an example of, and I'm going to start with an example that involves me. This is not about me complaining about people being mean to me. I don't care. But this first example involved me, and it's a very telling example, I think. So in a posting, and I hope that's legible at the back. I don't know if it is. In a posting at the Scholarly Kitchen about a year ago, I pointed out a pattern of consistent error and in some cases active misrepresentation in a database called RoarMap, which many of us will be familiar with. It's a database that brings together links to open access policies at various institutions. And I pointed out that a great many of what were being characterized as mandates in that database were in fact not mandates at all, and that some of the quotes from the non-mandatory policies that RoarMap links to had been edited in such a way that they looked more mandatory than they are. And I also mentioned that when I asked RoarMap's curators about these problems, I got no response. And by the way, I double-checked the examples that I cited in that Scholarly Kitchen posting just a few days ago while I was putting the final touches on this presentation, and those mistakes are all still there. So when I say I got no response, I mean I got no direct response, but here's how one person who read that posting characterized that posting on Twitter. And for those who might not be able to read it, it says, "RoarMap is a remarkable, increasingly transformational open access work by AMSI Forum, so naturally a target for the Scholarly Kitchen." So notice here that the response doesn't engage any of the issues involved. It just says, well, sure, someone from the Scholarly Kitchen would say that, wouldn't he? Here's another reaction from the blog of a very prominent and influential OA advocate. I'm sure we all know who this is. This is actually kind of funny, but notice the insinuation of sinister motives, the name calling, my posting constituted skullduggery. The blog is referred to as the scholarly scullery, etc. Not to mention the invention in this response of my call for publishers to do instead what Rohrmap has been doing. That was made up. He later corrected it when I called him on it. There did end up being some discussion of Rohrmap's problems in the comments section of that Scholarly Kitchen posting, by the way, and I think that discussion is instructive both in its tone and in its content, and I would recommend anybody who's interested to look it up. Again, to be very clear, I'm not complaining about people being mean to me in response to my posting. I'm providing these as examples of what happens when anybody, attempts to discuss problems with any open access enterprise. And here are a few more examples of how this kind of thing plays out. These tweets, and again, I'm not sure that they're legible at the back, they're a representative sample, I think, of the reaction to a statement that was made by the American Historical Association last year, in which it urged that graduate students in history be allowed to embargo their dissertations for up to 6 years instead of the 2 to 3 years that are more commonly allowed for dissertation embargoes, as long as they also deposit print copies of their dissertations in the library and make them available in that format in the meantime. So the Twitterverse erupted with characterizations like this is repressive and reactive. The AHA is dumb as a box of hair. Another one said that the AHA is dumb as toast, which I thought was cute. One commentator who wrote a 1,000-word piece in Inside Higher Education about this statement from the AHA said that allowing students to put a longer embargo on their dissertations amounted to treating them like children, which I thought was interesting, since it seemed to me more like it involved treating them like adults. But this is all fair enough. I mean, if you can't vent your anger at things you don't agree with, then what's the internet for? But what I found especially disturbing was the number of commentators on Twitter who vented their anger about the statement, apparently without having read it, or certainly without having understood it. So, for example, if you look at these 3 tweets, one of them says, AHA recommends PhDs embargo their ETDs. Another one says, I am speechless. AHA recommends PhD embargo their ETDs for 6 years. Another one says, I'm laughing about AHA's call to embargo dissertations. There was no call to embargo dissertations. There wasn't even a recommendation that people embargo dissertations. There was a call for students to be allowed to embargo their dissertations for a longer period than is normally allowed if they so choose. There was one critic who wrote about the AHA statement who couldn't seem to find anything objectionable in the text itself. So instead, he wrote a blog post criticizing the statement's subtext. In other words, criticizing it not for what it said, but for what the blogger was sure it really meant, despite the fact that it said something else. Another very prominent commentator actually said that we shouldn't look at whether or not ETDs have any impact on the salability of monographs. Here's the direct quote from him: "The reasons should be sought elsewhere." Now, obviously, these are not the only responses to the AHA statement, but I think that they're a pretty fair representation of the reaction that came from the open access community. The most egregious example of this kind of reaction, though, came in response to an article by science journalist John Bohannon, who wrote a piece in Science. It was a study of editorial practices at several hundred open access journals. He orchestrated a sting operation. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, but he set up a sting whereby he submitted a putatively scholarly paper, which actually contained nothing but nonsense, to 304 author-pays OA journals, just over half of which accepted it for publication. Now, obviously, this finding reflects the perverse incentive I mentioned earlier, that a journal that makes its money by accepting papers rather than by selling access to high-quality content has a structural incentive to accept low-quality papers. But instead of acknowledging this problem and expressing concern over the degree to which it's reflected in the fraudulent practices of the journals that Bohannon exposed, the OA community generally responded by attacking Bohannon. And you can find links to lots of examples of this at the Discussing OA website that I mentioned earlier, as well as fresh examples of attacks that were posted as comments on the Discussing OA website. Now, I want to be very clear that Bohannon's study was far from perfect. There are legitimate criticisms to be made of it, but what is not in question is that he uncovered a very serious problem among this population of open access journals. What all of these responses, and again, I believe that these are fairly representative. They're not all of the reactions, but I think they're representative. What these indicate to me is that the progress and growth of open access is being hindered by a shoot the messenger culture that inhibits the open access community's ability to deal with real issues and challenges. It's okay to talk about challenges involved with getting the word out, with evangelizing about OA. What is not okay to talk about is challenges and problems that arise from open access itself. There's another aspect to this problem, though, and it has less to do with punishing people who raise questions or concerns than it does with trying to prevent or preempt concerns from being expressed in the first place. And I've noticed a couple of strategies along these lines. One is to talk about constantly about open access's inevitability, its inexorable rise, its dramatic growth, and so forth, in terms that have more in common with war propaganda than with rational discourse. This tendency can sometimes be a bit embarrassing, but honestly, it's not that serious. Flag waving is fine, it has its place. But what's more troublesome is the second strategy, which is to encourage open access advocates to pretend that the war is already won. And I would urge you to consider this quote from another major open access leader and lobbyist. Here's the quote: "I think it's critical for us to recognize that the moment is in our hands when we need to stop thinking of open access as fighting to become the norm for research and scholarship, and to begin acting in ways that acknowledge that open access is the norm." That's the end of the quote. This is not a call for rational discourse. This is a call for magical thinking. I've seen estimates of open access's penetration of scholarly publishing that range from 2.5% of articles under gold and hybrid models to 20% under gold and green combined. But even at the top end of that range, it's obvious that toll access models remain very much the norm in scholarly publishing, for better or for worse. Pretending otherwise might be inspiring, but it also undermines our ability to talk in useful and realistic ways about the challenges that exist in the real world. And more perniciously than that, I think it also erodes our motivation to address real problems that are created by open access initiatives. After all, if the war is already won, then what's the point of raising concerns or pointing out problems? Another example of magical thinking is the common assertion that in cases where the public has paid for the research, this means the public has paid for the articles that result from it and therefore should get free access. This argument is implied in very common phrases like taxpayer access to publicly funded research. That phrase, which again is used all the time, uses a word game to produce a sort of an economic sleight of hand illusion. By pretending that the terms research and article mean the same thing, you hide the significant costs that are involved in turning research results into articles. What the public funds typically is the research itself, not the costly and subsequent processes that turn research results into documents that can be accessed by the public. You might as well argue that since the public paid for the subway to be built, that therefore nobody should have to pay to ride. But what about open access opponents? Are they more willing to discuss these matters in a reasonable way? And in fairness, I obviously have to address that issue. The problem is that I can hardly think of anybody who, to my knowledge, actually opposes open access, other than perhaps Jeffrey Beal, who's done excellent work on the problem of predatory publishing, but whose recent article attacking the OA movement was, in my view, unbalanced and inaccurate and unfair. But even when I look around at my fellow chefs in the scholarly kitchen, despite the way we are regularly characterized in the OA blogosphere, I don't see anybody who is actually opposed to open access. Several of us, in fact, including myself, are actively involved in supporting OA programs. In my experience, what gets a person characterized as an enemy isn't necessarily actual opposition to OA, but rather any public suggestion that OA entails problems and costs as well as benefits. It is important to point out that there are some organizations, particularly organizations of publishers and authors, such as the DC Principles Coalition, the Association of American Publishers, and the Copyright Alliance. They sometimes oppose particular OA initiatives, And some have actually taken an organizational stance that's more or less explicitly anti-OA. But none of these organizations or their representatives have, to my knowledge, engaged in the kind of shaming and conversation-stopping behaviors that I see regularly on the advocacy side. If others have experienced those kinds of behaviors from those organizations, by all means, share them in this discussion, either here today or on the blog. What I think we need is an environment in which it's possible for all stakeholders to speak openly and candidly and rationally about the pros and cons and the costs and benefits of all publishing models, not without fear of being contradicted, but without being shamed and silenced or accused of bad faith just because you're raising important and troublesome issues. When discussing OA or any other model of dissemination, we have got to be able to talk about both benefits and costs, because when we insist on talking only about benefits, we're not engaging in analysis, we're engaging in advocacy. And advocacy has its place, but its limitations should be obvious. It's in the nature of advocacy to try to quash any suggestion that the thing for which one is advocating produces anything other than benefits. And this seriously limits the advocate's ability to deal in a reasonable and effective way with problems in the real world. And I should point out here that obviously not everybody working for open access is trying to silence dissenters and doubters. In fact, I don't think most people who are working for open access are doing that. But the voices that are trying to discourage discussion and debate and that are trying to shame anybody who raises concerns are loud and public. And I'd be a lot less concerned about that if I saw more prominent figures in the movement standing up publicly in favor of open debate and critical analysis. There are an awful lot of voices in the OA community that are calling on us to fall into line, to come to the altar, to join the movement, to accept that either resistance is futile or victory is inevitable, depending on your perspective. And I wish that I heard more voices inviting us to raise concerns, to help resolve and identify issues, and to anticipate problems. I wish I saw the embrace of dissent that most of us in libraries would, in any other context, consider to be an essential aspect of intellectual engagement. There are some skeptics out there who are willing to raise their voices, even if by doing so they run the risk of being put on an enemies list. But an awful lot of others have decided that keeping their heads down is the better and safer path. The sad thing is that the OA community would almost certainly benefit in the long run from listening to what the critics and questioners have to say. So this leads to the last item, and then we can discuss here. How do we do it? How do we foster an environment where critical and constructive discussion of open access is possible? Here are 6 steps that I think all of us, no matter where we sit on the advocacy spectrum, can take. So the first one is to acknowledge that all models have pros and cons. Any discussion that proceeds from the assumption that open access or toll access or any other model of scholarly communication has only upsides or only downsides is a discussion that is not going to be honest and is highly unlikely to go in productive directions. Imagine, even if there were a system that produced universal access to scholarship, that system is going to have costs and downsides that impact dimensions of scholarship other than access. So here's a thought experiment that each of us can undertake in the privacy of our own minds. Think of your favorite access model. So maybe you're a for-profit publisher and subscription revenues are essential to your business. Or maybe you're an open access advocate and your ideal scenario is 100% green OA with no embargoes. Now ask yourself this question. If my ideal solution were universally adopted, what would be the downsides for scholarship? If you can't think of any, then one of 2 things is true. Either your preferred model is perfect, or you're not examining your preferred model fairly. So the second, comprehend and then respond. This is good advice anytime, but especially in this area, I think too often productive conversation is derailed because one or more of the participants is responding not to what somebody said, but to some distortion or misrepresentation of what was said. And obviously, each of us can be careful to avoid that mistake and quickly take responsibility when we do make it. The third is to focus on substance rather than on supposed motivations. This is one of the hardest things as a library administrator and a manager. One of the hardest things to accept is the difficult and unpleasant fact that a miserable person of ill will can still speak the truth. And I'm not saying that speakers' motivations are entirely irrelevant by any means, but when it comes to finding workable solutions to real-world problems, ultimately it's the truth or untruth of what is said that actually matters most. And attributing ill intent to others is far too often a ploy for distracting people from the substantive issue. This is a major flaw, by the way, I think, with Jeffrey Beall's article about OA. It focuses way too much on what he thinks OA advocates really want, which is apparently a communist takeover or something, rather than on what they actually do and say. And it's also a major flaw with much of the OA community's commentary on the Bohannon sting. Fifth, avoid poisoned well and ad hominem arguments. This is related to the question of motivation, but it's not quite the same thing. Poisoned well and ad hominem arguments say, no matter what that guy says, we shouldn't listen because he's a bad person or because he believes in bad thing X. Anytime you hear somebody using this line of argument, chances are good that he's afraid of what will happen if you look closely at the issue in question. And so he's trying to focus shift your focus away from the issue and towards the defects of the person raising the issue, and obviously none of us should engage in this kind of argumentation. Then the last item is that we need to take unintended and unexpected consequences seriously. This is very hard to do when you're operating from a mission-driven perspective. When you're operating from a mission-driven perspective, you only want to focus on intended consequences. When you're operating from a bottom-line driven perspective, you feel a strong need to anticipate unintended consequences and to provide for them. So no matter what initiative you undertake, whether it's a new toll access journal or an open access policy or an institutional repository or a change to copyright law, some of the consequences of your initiative are going to be ones that you intend and that you wish for, and others are going to be unexpected and undesired. And one of the dangers of advocacy is that it carries with it an incentive to discount the unintended and the unexpected and to focus on the intended and the expected. Sorry, that wasn't the last point. The last point is invite all stakeholders to the table, and I'm gonna close by dropping the last page of my notes on the floor. I'm going to close by sharing a quote from my colleague T. Scott Pluchak, who many of you know. He's the director of the Lister Hill Library at the University of Alabama, and for the record, he is a strong open access supporter. But a few years ago, Scott participated in a scholarly publishing roundtable that Fred Dilla was instrumental in putting together that was convened by the U.S. Congress under the aegis of the House Science and Technology Committee. And the roundtable included representatives from both the public and private sectors, including librarians, scholars, academic administrators, toll access publishers, OA publishers, and scholarly society officers. The documents and the recommendations that came out of this group's work can be found at the AAU's website. And they're very interesting. I'm sure many of us have read them. One outcome that's worth noting, never mind. So after it was all done, Pluchak later observed, and this is a direct quote from Scott, he said, "The recommendations of the roundtable were largely incorporated into the America Competes Act and substantially informed the requirements laid out in the Holdren OSTP memo. The roundtable remains, as far as I'm aware, the only significant OA-related activity to have active and equal participation from librarians, publishers large and small, commercial and not-for-profit, as well as senior representatives from the university community." Now listen to this next sentence. "Certainly, its success in influencing federal policy is a reflection of that, despite the fact that it was that very inclusiveness that led to its being immediately dismissed by many of the loud voices in the debate. It's been explicit in our discussions with policymakers that they are seeking moderate and inclusive views to help develop policy." That's the end of the quote. Moderation and inclusiveness are unpopular notions in many segments of our society today, particularly in the United States. Nowhere, I believe, more so than in the scholarly communication wars. The problem is that when we're dealing with complex problems that involve many stakeholders, that involve needs that are in tension with each other, and that involve inevitable trade-offs, moderation and inclusiveness are essential to a rational and productive discussion. And with that, let's discuss rationally and candidly.
So, who wants to take up the challenge to start some rational debate? Fred, of course. Richard behind there.
I asked Fred for a softball question specifically, so.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very rational, balanced discussion with us. And I hope it instills a lot more of this kind of activity that you call for. So let me ask you a question on behalf of all my colleagues here. You started out by noting the plight of many librarians with their budgetary situation for journal acquisition. And I would say as a publishing community, we have not done enough to help strengthen your voice within the university's administration. The Dean of Libraries is down a pecking order from the provost with the cash box, and we haven't strengthened your voice. That's not to say that there isn't problems on the supply side with pricing, but if you look at research budgets at universities, they have scaled with college tuitions in the U.S. I mean, they've gone up at very healthful clip, 5 to 10% compounded over the last 40 years. But library acquisition budgets haven't. So what can we do to help you strengthen your voice?
That's a question that I get asked a lot when I raise the problem of annual price hikes in the company of publishers. And I think the simple answer to that question is you're right that R&D budgets have gone up at a healthy clip. I think we could probably also show that athletic budgets have gone up at a healthy clip. I am 100% certain that you could not identify a single academic department or program whose budget has gone up at 5 to 10% a year. And the likelihood that the library or any other institutional budget, no matter what publishers say to provosts, are going to go up at a rate that matches the annual increase rate for STEM journals. I can't see it happening. I was going to say, I don't think the problem is that provosts don't recognize our value. I'm confident that provosts do recognize our value. I think that there is truth in the observation that provosts probably do not recognize the necessity of bolstering library budgets. I mean, it's one thing to recognize value, it's another thing to recognize genuine need and but see, even when I say that, I can't imagine saying to a provost with a straight face, and I think I was saying this to you last night, Fred, I can't imagine saying to a provost with a straight face, you have $1 million, it would necessarily be better for you to give that $1 million to the library than it would be to refurbish the physics lab. And those are exactly the kinds of problems that are exactly the kinds of choices that provosts have to make. So, and the other thing, and this sounds tendentious, and some of you may have heard me say it anyway, but one of the struggles that I think we have on the library side, when publishers say to us, you don't have a pricing problem, you have a funding problem, is that it kind of feels like, you've been knocked down again by the kid on the playground and he's taking your lunch money and he's saying to you, you don't have a bullying problem, you have a funding problem. You need to ask your mom for more money. And I apologize. I mean, that's not entirely fair, but it's kind of fair. And I should say too, it's not. There are people in my profession who go on and on about the evil publishers who are, just raising their prices because they know that they can get it because they have monopoly control over their content, and that's true. There are some publishers who do that. When a publisher comes to me and says, hey, I want to send a vice president and a sales rep on a plane to your library so that they can explain our new pricing model to you, I know that means they're about to raise my price by 40%. And what they want to do is try to explain how they arrived at that 40% in a way that will make me feel better about it, which is not possible. But that's not most publishers. And the other thing that I think often my colleagues don't understand is the cost, the increasing costs that publishers face that are directly incident to the huge explosion of research output around the world. The cost of rejection is high, the cost of rejection is growing, and the cost of rejection is something that we on the consumer end never ever see. I recognize that, and I know that your costs are going up. I don't expect your costs to be flat every year. if you keep raising your prices 8 to 10% a year, your journal is eventually going to get canceled. And it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong in raising that price 8 to 10% a year. It doesn't matter. The money's not there.
If there are no other questions immediately in the room, I have one for you, Rick. I really liked the way that you laid out a sort of a point plan of how we should be having this conversation. And we frequently have discussions internally within the industry about how do we have a rational conversation about open access. And it's very hard, because you showed that even as a librarian known to be an advocate of open access, it's hard for you to raise an issue. It's impossible for me or anybody in publishing to raise the same kinds of issues. So how do we reset this? How do we have this kind of rational discussion? What forum could we envisage that would allow us to do that?
That's a really good question. And I think, first of all, I should correct something. I don't think it's fair to say that I am generally seen as an advocate of open access. The fact that I run an open access program doesn't seem to carry any weight. The fact that I write for the Scholarly Kitchen seems to matter a lot more. But I would kind of, one thing that I think might help would be if there were some way, and I don't know if this is possible, but if there were some way to institutionalize something like the roundtable that Fred and his colleagues set up. Something that doesn't just result in a report, as valuable as that report was, but something that can be an ongoing forum for conversation and analysis around scholarly communication models. Not just open access, but scholarly communication models generally. Somebody would have to underwrite that, and who underwrote it would have a big impact on how seriously it was taken. Mm-hmm. But if there were an established forum with a generally recognized reputation for fairness and balance and good analysis, to which people could refer when they're having intemperate conversations about these issues at their institutions or on a blog or in an argument with somebody in Twitter, I think that could be really helpful. Honestly, I think the Scholarly Kitchen could be something like that. We would just have to figure out some way to shake off the anti-OA reputation that we've gained, and I don't think that reputation is entirely unearned. I do think that it's exaggerated.
So, anyone in the room want to take up that challenge?
I have a question. Hi, Rick. It's Christopher McKenzie from Wiley.
Hey, Chris.
So, help me understand something. Commercial publishers are not the only beneficiaries of downstream federally funded research. So, for example, when Colgate-Palmolive uses research funded by the government, carried out at the University of Utah, published in one of our journals, to make toothpaste that makes my teeth whiter, no one is calling on them to somehow reimburse the government for the research that's enabled them to, quote unquote, improve their product. So what am I missing? Why is it just commercial publishers who are called out for this?
I'm not sure I understand. Sorry, hang on to the mic for a sec. I'm not sure I completely understand the question. So
Pfizer.
Nobody's upset because Colgate. I think what I hear you saying is if this line of argument were consistent, then the same people who are saying Wiley shouldn't be charging for access to the papers resulting from publicly funded research should also be saying Colgate-Palmolive shouldn't be charging for access to toothpaste based on science that was generated using public money. Is that right?
It's generally correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's hard to have an open and honest discussion if that's what your response is going to be.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not standing here defending those who say Wiley shouldn't charge but who don't say Colgate shouldn't charge. I agree with you that that represents an inconsistency, and so I don't have an answer to the question, why do they do that? I think it is an indication of logical inconsistency on the part of people who say that.
You have a question at the back?
Yeah, thanks. Tom Reller from Elsevier. Rick, on your point about the scholarly kitchen, I was going to say the same thing, that it could be a great forum, and it is in a lot of ways. My only criticism of the scholarly kitchen is that it seems to be like the same 5 people, or maybe like the same 10 people, and you're having the same conversations over and over and over again. As an editorial team, do you guys talk about how to widen discussion, make it a little bit more of an inviting place to be, and maybe even like a call to action for a lot of people in this room to, just to broaden the scope and the number of people that are engaged there?
Yeah, we talk about that all the time, actually. It's something that we're acutely aware of. Now, I am not the editor, and so I can't speak for the scholarly kitchen, but I can tell you that that is a topic of conversation that comes up all the time. One of the problems that we have is that when we invite people from other perspectives to come write, they very often say no. There is, as anybody who reads the kitchen knows, there is often very lively debate in the comments. There are people who feel intimidated by that lively debate. And I can't criticize that. I mean, not everybody wants to get yelled at by either one person or another from inside or outside the kitchen. But if people aren't willing to engage in debate, we can't force them to. We have been trying to have more guest postings. We've been actively reaching out to people who are not part of the stable of writers at the Scholarly Kitchen. In fact, I believe today's entry is a guest posting. I solicited a guest posting that was published a week or so ago. So we're trying to do more of that. Obviously, the comments section is open to absolutely anybody. Our ratio of comments to postings is about 10-1. And we consider, I know that I can say on behalf of the group that we consider that to be a mark of the blog's success. Anybody who thinks of the Scholarly Kitchen as an echo chamber is not reading most of what gets written in the Scholarly Kitchen, most of which is arguments with us. All I can say to that is, if anybody is interested in writing for the Scholarly Kitchen, either because you agree with things that you've read there or because you very much disagree with things that are written there, please contact me or any other chef. We are always looking for new voices to bring in, but obviously we can't force anybody to participate.
Question here from Michael.
Rick, I was very interested in the remarks you made about the problem of the public funding must equal public access argument, because that's something I've been fighting against in Brussels and in Washington for longer than I care to remember. And I wonder whether, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, I wonder whether it's got more to do with the somewhat limited purview of politicians rather than anything else, because I remember having a conversation with the leader of a Senate caucus on science on this thing, and I sort of said to him, well, you could use that argument to allow members of the US citizens to sit on aircraft carriers leaving San Diego and going to Hawaii. That would be a perfectly reasonable approach of that same argument. And he said, yeah, well, you're right, but that argument won't fly on the Hill. And I thought that was just the most ultimate non sequitur, and I just wonder whether you think it's politicians are the problem.
Well, I think, realpolitik is realpolitik, and just because it doesn't make sense and just because it's stupid doesn't mean that it's not going to fly on the Hill. And ultimately, politicians have to deal with the real world of the political environment in which they're working. And you or I can sit and convince an individual legislator of the rightness of our position, whatever that may be. But right positions go down to defeat every single day in every legislative body in the world. And, to me, it's kind of like, well, why don't library budgets increase by 10% a year? Let's all agree that they should. Okay, agreed. Whew. Are they going to increase 10% a year? No, never. It's never going to happen. It doesn't matter how good an argument you make. And I think it's the same thing with stupid legislation. no matter how stupid it may be and no matter how well you demonstrate its stupidity, that has only a limited bearing on whether or not it's going to pass. And that's not just true in the U.S. Congress. That's true in every legislative body in the world, I think.
We have time for one more.
What a
at the
grim
back.
presentation this has turned into.
Mark Carden from Mosaic Recruitment. Rick, great presentation. I'm afraid I've missed the first couple of minutes, but it's still the best presentation I've seen this year. You mentioned something about cost rather than price, and it seems to me that one of the big problems is that academics and librarians don't seem to recognize the costs involved in publishing. And the other day I heard an academic saying, I would never pay a submission fee because it doesn't cost anything at all for a journal to receive a submission and get a peer review done. But this person meant it very sincerely. Do you think there are ways to, for publishers and others, to communicate to academics and librarians what these real costs are and why somebody needs to pay those costs somehow?
Boy, that's hard. And it's hard because academics and librarians represent two real but very, very different customers, obviously, for a publisher, right? The librarian is the customer in the sense that the librarian, for a campus subscription, the librarian is the one paying the invoice. The librarian is not the customer that's using the content. The author is a customer in that you are selling to an author publication services. You are selling them either in exchange for cash if you're publishing under an author pays gold OA model, or more commonly, you are paying, what you are getting from the author in payment is access to the author's copyright so that you can publish the content. So what you've got to convince the author of, if you're proposing an author pays model, what you've got to convince the author of is that the particular publication service that you yourself provide, as distinct from another publisher in the same discipline, is worth the cost of coming up with that money. And this is something else that I've written about, which is that I think it's just so fascinating that in the market for authors, publishers are operating in a competitive marketplace. If there are 3 biology journals that are all publishing in the same general area of biology, and there is an author who needs to publish an article in a good journal, the author can pick from any of those 3 journals the one that he or she thinks is the best one, and the same way that I would choose between a Toyota and a Ford and a Honda, will pick the one that he or she likes best. When you're selling that journal to a subscriber, whether it's a librarian or an individual subscriber, it's not the same competitive dynamic. There you're operating in a market of complements. So if I, as a librarian, cancel the library's subscription to Biology Journal A and instead subscribe to Biology Journal B, and a faculty member comes steaming into my office and says, how can you have possibly canceled Biology Journal A, which is the greatest biology journal ever published? And I say, oh, it's okay though. We have Biology Journal B. The professor is not going to go away happy, because choosing between 2 different biology journals is not like choosing between a Ford and a Honda. It's like choosing between a stove and a refrigerator. They do very different things because each one has unique content. Now, you may have noticed that I'm completely circumventing your question here. And I'm prepared to go on for another several minutes if necessary. But I think the reason I'm doing that is because I really don't know how you can. I mean, I can think of ways that we could help faculty understand the true costs of publishing a journal. The problem is all of the ways that I can think of involve a willing audience, and they're not. They don't care. They couldn't care less what it takes to publish a journal. They have their own jobs to do. In libraries, I think we tend to care a little bit more because we tend to be interested in the scholarly communication ecosystem. The problem is that ultimately we may agree with you that your journal is worth $5,000 a year or whatever. You might convince me that that is a completely reasonable price. Ultimately, the question is going to be, can I pay it or can I not? Doesn't matter whether you've convinced me of the value of it. What matters is the number on the invoice compared to the number on my budget. And if I can't pay it, the fact that I agree with you that it's worth that price is irrelevant.
I think that's a very good note to finish on, and I would certainly like to thank Rick, because I think you've given us all a huge amount to think about, and you've given us a challenge. Let's see if in the room we can rise to that challenge of finding a way to have a rational debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.